Hey everybody, and welcome back to Jim's Garage. The awesome people at MinisForum sent me their newest device, the MS-A1. Now, they also sent me this as well, the docking station that goes with it. More on that later. Now, as you know, I'm a big fan of MinisForum, and I have 3 of their MS-01s, which I still think, sort of 6 months on, it's probably still the best small form factor Homelab device that you can buy. But this video is not about that. This is about the MS-A1. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that this was just the AMD equivalent of the MS-01. Truth be told, it couldn't be further from the truth. And I'm at risk of upsetting MinisForum here, but I actually think this device has missed the mark a little bit. It is redeemed in its cost because it's significantly cheaper, but if you're looking for an AMD-based Homelab server, this isn't the one. So I'm going to flip this video on its head and give you my conclusion, and then I'll dip into how I reached that, so you don't have to skip to the end. So my biggest gripes with the MS-A1 are pretty much that it has no expansion slot via PCIe. On the MS-01, you'll notice it has a PCIe 4x8 slot, and you can simply pull the cover off and insert a small form factor card, low profile, in there. That gives you expansion to, say, 100 gig networking, or quite powerful, but again, not the 4090s or anything like that. It has to be a low profile GPU. This, on the other hand, doesn't have any internal PCIe slot, and it offers an Oculink instead, hence why I had this thing here. This is an Oculink docking station. What this allows you to do is plug a cable from here into here and host a PCIe device. Traditionally, that's probably going to be a GPU for better hardware acceleration, GPU acceleration, etc. But there's no reason why you couldn't install a network card. But it just seems like a bit of an inelegant solution, because you could do something similar on the MS-01 if you wanted. Not only on the MS-01 could you get a card that fits in the case and is thus a nice discrete package, but if you wanted to, like in one of my previous videos where I got an M.2 extender, you can get PCIe riser cables and you could effectively have the same setup, but with the bells and whistles of having 10 gig networking, dual Thunderbolt 4, and the dual 2.5 gigabit networking cards that this one has. So in summary, do I recommend this device for a home lab? Absolutely not. But it might be good if you're looking for a small form factor PC that's on a budget, because this comes in both a pre-configured and a bare bones option, and it's good to see that it supports desktop CPUs, not laptop CPUs. So I think there still is a market for this, but if you're looking in the home lab space, I still think the MS-01 is the better buy. Anyway, let's jump into a review now of this device, and I'll tell you how I got to this conclusion. So hopping on to their product website, you'll see that it starts at £239 here in the UK, which is pretty good for a bare bones machine that has good build quality, much like the MS-01. It's an all metal shell, so the outside here is all metal, with the front and the back ends being plastic. Now, the model that I was sent is the 8700G, and it also came with 32 gigs of DDR5 memory and a 1TB Kingston NVMe drive. So if you wanted to go for some configuration like that, if you wanted the 8700G, the 32 gigs of RAM and the 1TB, you're looking at £709. Now let's have a look at that compared to the MS-01. So here is the MS-01, and you know I love this device, and MinisForum have done an excellent job on this. And if I give it a 13900H, which is the model that I have, and I give it 32 gigs of RAM and a 1TB SSD, it comes to $779. So we've got a delta there of what, £70. And the CPU performance, both of these have a core CPU benchmark of about 30,000 on Passmark. Again, that's not a scientific method, but at least it gives us an apples to apples comparison on many of the typical use cases. Now, what's the difference here? Well, as you can see, for £70 you're getting 2 10 gig network connections on the back, you're getting dual Thunderbolt 4, and you're also getting that all-important internal expansion slot, so that along here you could put another device in there, and it's in that discrete single package. You don't need the Oculink docking station that comes with the MS-A1. So I think that really kind of sums up my biggest gripe with this device. And to be fair to MinisForum, they're probably constrained by the hardware costs of what they put in it. I just think for a Homelabber, and that's pretty much what my channel is and what I do, it just doesn't have the value proposition of the MS-01. But anyway, let's get further into this device and let's have a look at what's going under the hood, because there might be some edge cases where this device might be right for you. So the MS-A1 comes with the AM5 platform from AMD, and it doesn't necessarily have to use just the 8000 series. There is support for the 9000 series. Now, obviously, you're probably scratching your head thinking, well, what could I put in this thing? And I believe the device is built for a 65 watt TDP CPU, so bear that in mind. If you're going to put in something like a 9950X, I'm not sure if that's actually supported, but I'm demonstrating a point. You're not going to be able to cool that with the internal cooling here. Albeit, I must say the cooling solution here is great. It is noticeably quieter than my MS-01. I think that's due to the dual fan setup and the orientation in the MS-A1, and the fan quality seems to be improved as well. So good job on that one, MinisForum. I wish my MS-01 was a little bit quieter, but I still think I'm happy with the trade-off. Now, one good thing with the MS-A1 with the 8700G that I got, and there'll be G counterparts in the 9000 series which will likely have a faster APU, is the graphics is pretty powerful in this device. Now, don't get me wrong, you're not going to be running the latest AAA titles at 4K with HDR, but I was able to sit back and play Doom Eternal at 60 FPS on 1080p with medium settings. Now, that might not sound amazing, but if you cast your mind back maybe 2 or 3 years, the fact that we're now getting integrated graphics cards that can run AAA titles at medium 1080p is pretty astounding. And, again, although I poo-pooed it slightly, if you were to put an Oculink in here and you were to add another GPU to this device, then you could get significantly higher frame rates. Now, this is where it kind of trends on to maybe where I'm thinking this device might be aimed at. It has workstation in the title. So maybe for somebody who wants to have a portable, reasonably high performance device, this could be one use case. You maybe take your small form factor to work, and then when you come home, you might want to game on it or something, and to do that, you might want to plug in a powerful GPU. Or something like a graphics editor, something like that, something that requires GPU acceleration for your workload. Again, you've got some of that flexibility. The flip side, as I've mentioned though, is you could put a riser cable into your MS-01, and whilst you'd have to run this thing without the case on, it might look a bit ugly, you'd basically get the same result, arguably more performant, because Oculink is PCIe 4x4 and the MS-01 is PCIe 4x8. In real world testing, and you've seen this on the likes of Gamers Nexus and Linus Tech Tips, where they've run things like a GPU at half the bandwidth, you get minimal performance loss on most applications. Remember that PCIe 4x4 is still PCIe 3x8. And like I've just mentioned, those demonstrations of running a GPU at PCIe 3x16 and 3x8 yield very similar results. One thing that sets this apart from the MS-01 though is the fact that you can use a desktop CPU and that CPU is removable. So because you can buy a bare bones, you can stick your own CPU in. That means that maybe in the future you've got a decent upgrade path in this device, and who knows, if you've got access to some stellar deals on hardware, maybe you could build out an MS-A1 for significantly cheaper, and then that value proposition becomes less of an issue. As I mentioned earlier, I think the cooling solution in the MS-A1 is pretty impressive. Instead, on this device, it's got the 2 fans on the one side, and those both exhaust out of the back. On the previous version, you had a noisy fan in the back on the MS-01, which was solely there to cool the NVMe drives, which, in my experience, I don't think is strictly necessary, or possibly just in my workload where I don't have a heavy-hitting GPU that's dumping some heat into the case. It has a single USB 4 interface, which could be useful for adding peripherals, but again, when you pair this to the MS-01, that had those dual Thunderbolt ports. And if you've seen my videos before, you'll notice that I used that in a ring network for my Proxmox cluster, and I was able to get about 2.5 gigabytes per second for my Ceph network, which was great. I basically got 2 additional network cards. The network cards in here, the traditional RJ45, it's good to see that they're both dual 2.5 gigabit. However, they are real tech, so you might have a real problem on some operating systems, especially if you're just trying to install something. You're going to need to bake in their drivers during installation. I noticed that when I tried to install pfSense on this device, it didn't install the drivers up front, so I had to manually load those into the installation. But once it was up and running, I didn't seem to hit any problems, and the behavior of the device was as expected. Thanks to the display connections, this will support triple monitors. They put 8K on the advertising, and yes, it does technically support 8K at 30 FPS, but nobody's going to be running this thing at 8K. I think 1080p, maybe a couple of monitors at 4K, not doing too much heavy lifting, is probably the sweet spot. Now, the 8700G CPU is a pretty good CPU for this device, and it comes at a pretty compelling price point. Now, through some of the benchmarking I did, this was more efficient than the 13900H in my MS-01, and it did run cooler and less noisily. That's with the RAM and the single NVMe. Obviously, with more NVMe drives in there, that would likely get a little bit higher. Now, the device supports DDR5 memory, which is great for that on-die ECC, and it's pretty fast in terms of its support. Mine comes with 5200 megahertz. Again, it's not bleeding edge, but it's in a compact form factor, and it's good to see that it supports up to 96 gigabytes of memory off the bat. Now, this takes SODIMM, which is kind of your typical laptop memory, so you're not going to be sticking regular sized DIMMs into this, and that can impact both the availability and the price when you're building this thing. Now, the MS-A1 supports up to 4 NVMe drives, but only one of those is at full 4x4 speed. Now, unfortunately, the model that they shipped me with the Kingston NVMe drive, although that is a PCIe 4 NVMe drive, the speeds are basically NVMe 3. When I benchmarked this, I got about 3000 on the read and about 2000 on the write, and we know from some of the top in class now, the Samsung 990s for example, you can get around 7 and 5 gigabytes per second on those newer devices. So I didn't have means to test that, but this thing should support those drives. Now, it's very important to note that the drives are not all 4x4, and I'll come on to that later when we go through the specification. It will depend which slot that you put the NVMe drive into. So if we take a moment to look at this diagram of the device, you'll see what I was talking about earlier. To take this apart, you don't have the nice mechanism of simply pulling it apart using the tab on the MS-01, where the case is basically a sheath that comes off. That's great because it gives you rapid access to the internals. In this, you're going to be reaching for your screwdriver, which is frustrating. Now, you need one screwdriver and a set of screws to get this side off, and the similar for the other. You can't just do one set of screws and slide the whole thing off. As you can see, it doesn't slide off. In fact, this one peels apart. One thing, as I mentioned though, you've got the dual coolers here with the 4 heat pipes on the top. Now, this is like a very performant laptop cooler from my experience, and I mentioned it before, I'm pretty impressed with the engineering that's gone into the cooling solution. During all of my testing, it did remain quiet. So possibly if power efficiency, cooling, temperatures, etc. are really important to you, then this could be worth a look. So a lot of fanfare was made around this device supporting Oculink, and I think Oculink is a good solution, but it's still annoying that it came at the cost of having some internal support for a card. I wish MinisForum would create something slightly bigger, and I say this slightly bigger even than the MS-01, or find some novel way of creating an extendable case. I'm trying to do that with my 3D printer, where I want to try and create a new case for it. The purpose being I could put in different height cards. One of the main gripes with this machine, the MS-01, and well, not a gripe with this one other than it doesn't have a PCIe lane, is that it can't support full slot cards. Now, if they could change that, again, that will be another arrow in the quiver of this device's success. There's no reason why you couldn't have a discrete GPU. It feels like there are some wasted PCIe lanes in here, and also have Oculink as well if you wanted. So a quick look at the I/O, and it's okay. On the front, we've got a headphone jack, we've got USB 2, and then we've got 2 USB 3.2s ×2, not ×4. On the back, we've got those dual RJ45 2.5 gigs. We've got a DisplayPort 2, we've got an HDMI 2.1, which is good, 4K 120Hz HDR. We've got a Type-C, we've got a 3.2 times 1, so not as fast as the ones on the front. And we've also got another USB 2 times 1, and then we've just got the Oculink, which will be for that external dock. Again, that doesn't come with this device, that is an optional extra. So if you are planning on using a discrete card, you will have to buy a dock that supports Oculink. So now let's jump into the technical specifications. It's the 8700G in the model that I've got, but as I've mentioned, you can choose pretty much anything that's compatible from the AM5 range. And I talk about compatibility, power being one of those key constraints. Interestingly, there's an error on here, that should be 96 gigabytes. And then we get onto the actual storage itself. So they only list 3 here, but my understanding is, and from looking internally, it supports 4 NVMe. But the crucial thing here I want to call out is the speed difference in those devices. If you look closely at the bottom here, you're only getting one device that's going to give you that 4x4. So similar to the MS-A1, where the NVMe drives are all different speeds, which could be a problem depending on what you're trying to do. But you're still going to get some good speed out of these. So this one's going to run at a maximum speed of about 7.5 gigabytes per second. You then get basically a quarter of that speed in this one. And then this one here, you get about half the speed of this one here. So bear that in mind when you're buying this. You're not going to get full 4x4 in every slot. And mine came shipped with Windows 11. And since it came with Windows 11, like I've said, I've put pfSensor and it worked. I've also put Proxmox onto it and that was fine. But again, with the lack of expansion options through an internal card, network card, etc., and the lack of onboard networking already, it doesn't feel like a great fit for Proxmox. Unless you wanted something that was really bare bones and you could get the components to build this cheaply, then maybe it's an option. Obviously, as I mentioned before, the power efficiency, the noise and the thermals are really good on this device.